Hello and welcome to Power Speaking Live. I'm Carrie Beckstrom, the host of this monthly series and the CEO of Power Speaking. Now, before we dive into today's topic, I'd like to do a quick pulse check. Let me know by putting your response in chat which of these you struggle with the most as a technical leader. Is it A, communicating up to executives, B, communicating to your team, C, communicating across the organization to peers and other departments, D, providing tough feedback, or E, avoiding the tendency to micromanage? We put those options in chat, take a look at them, and add whatever letter corresponds with the one you find most challenging. I'll give you a few minutes to respond. Oh, Lisa, brave and I love the honesty. A and E. Let's get a few more responses. Now, what you may have noticed is that none of those challenges that I referenced have to do with technical competence. They're about communication. And as many of us know, so often technical professionals are promoted to leadership roles because they're exceptional at solving complex problems. They think rigorously, they value precision, they dive deep. Those are all strengths. But here's the subtle twist. The very habits that make someone a brilliant engineer or scientist can create friction in leadership. And I'm talking about habits such as the instinct to provide more detail to ensure clarity, to quickly jump in and solve the problem yourself, to demonstrate your expertise in the room. None of those behaviors are bad. It's just that in leadership roles, they don't always land as intended. So the question becomes, as a brilliant technical leader, how can you evolve your communication so that you project confidence without micromanaging, you influence without getting into the weeds, and you deliver tough feedback without eroding trust? The switch from technical expert to leadership is not automatic, and it's rarely explicitly taught, which is why I'm so excited for today's conversation. And joining me is Dr. Gwen Acton, who is the author of the invaluable book, Leadership for Scientists and Engineers. And Gwen has spent decades helping technical professionals manage that transition from subject matter expert to leader with confidence, clarity, and impact. Gwen, it is a thrill to have you here.
It's great to be here. So thank you so much, Carrie, for having me here. What a fantastic topic for us to be addressing today.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And what I thought might be most useful for our audience is to start with some general questions to help frame the conversation. And then we'll get into some more specific how-to type advice. And for those of you in the audience, I encourage you to put your questions in chat. And if you have advice you'd like to share, please include that in chat as well. And also, if you haven't noticed, when I was introducing Gwen, we included a number of tremendous resources for you, including her book. So Gwen, in your experience, what would you say is the most common communication challenge that individuals face as they transition from a subject matter expert to a leadership role, and why do they often persist?
So let me take the first part, which is what challenges do technical experts have in communication as they become managers? And so one of the common, you mentioned one of them, which is providing too many details. We'll often hear complaints about data dumps, for example. There's just too much information that's provided. So that is a very common problem that technical experts have. And, one of the reasons for that is how I'm a PhD scientist myself, and that is how we are trained. We are trained to provide all of those details to have as much precision as we can. And I think the second common issue I see, having worked with literally thousands of different technical experts who are now leaders, is that we have a tendency to think we are more clear than we actually are. And I think that is because, again, when we are just talking about the work or the technical aspects, it's pretty straightforward. It's very fact-based. There's not a lot of room for subtlety. We can challenge each other if we feel like anything is imprecise. When you move into a leadership position, there's a lot more ambiguity, a lot less certainty, and a lot more complicated people interaction issues that start to impinge on that communication. And so oftentimes that we are thinking that we are being very clear by putting all that data up without realizing that there are, besides just the pure technical information, there are other issues that need to be addressed. And I'll just throw one out really quickly because I often have people in my workshops and people I'm coaching or working with say they want to motivate their teams. Well, motivation is not just about throwing a lot of data up there. It involves a number of other complexities and interactions that need to be woven into that communication. So I think those are two examples.
So, so well said. And just the way in which you described it gives me an even greater appreciation for why that transition takes time, practice, and intentionality. My goodness. And again, in a bit, we'll be getting into some of so how do you make that transition? Before we do that, what would you say, and you kind of touched on this, but again, as an individual transitions from deep technical expert to a leader role, what is the most essential communication habit they need to unlearn?
So I think one of the biggest differences in communication when you go from individual contributor to a manager or leadership position is that it is like you are speaking into a megaphone. By that, I mean everything you say and do in terms of communication is heard or interpreted much more loudly. And that is for better or for worse. It means that you are able to state your opinion and influence the organization and your team more than as a peer. But it also means, and this is very unsettling, that what you say and do, they can easily interpret it very differently when you are a leader versus when you are a peer. And let me give you a couple examples. For example, if you're a technical expert talking to another peer and you say, that's not a good idea, the other person hears it as like, you don't think it's a good idea. Technically speaking, there's some issue here. But if you say those exact same words in that exact same sort of edgy, abrupt way that we technical experts have of communicating our dislike of things when they're not exactly precise or the way we think they should be. If we say the exact same thing in the exact same way when we're a leader and they are let's say they're one of our team members, then they can hear this very differently as that we think they're doing a terrible job, even though we didn't say that. Or if as a leader, if I'm in a bad mood, let's say my tooth hurts, right? And I'm just in a bad mood. If I'm with a peer, they're just like, oh, Gwen's in a bad mood today. But if I'm the leader, they can easily hear it as there's something wrong at the company because the leaders have more information and they must know what's going on at the company. And that's not at all. It was just my tooth was hurting, right? Or, another example, and this is really common, is that if I, as a leader, send an email after hours, late at night, after work hours, on a weekend, sometime outside of normal working hours, if that's a peer again, they just like, oh, that person's working hard, whatever. They can just not worry about it. But if I am their direct manager, the message that gets sent is that I, as an employee, should be working after hours. So it's completely unintentional. And this happens, I see it all the time, that completely without realizing it, that the leader is communicating in ways that they just did not realize because there's more authority, they influence things more when they are the leader. And they're also nonverbal. Like, for example, if you're the boss and you are distracted during a meeting, right, and you're reading your screen, for example, again, they can interpret that as like you don't care, you're not interested, etc. So I would say that is one of the for communication, that is extremely important to understand that when you're a leader, you are heard differently because there are other dynamics besides just the technical aspects that are taking place. As a leader, you are impacting what somebody's working on, possibly their pay, their promotion, their visibility, their opportunities, their career advancement. And so people are going to listen and care about what you say in a different way.
Yeah, yeah, which just underscores the importance of really focusing on this and learning how to communicate more effectively in a much more audience-centric way. Just the other thing I'd add, and this isn't just applicable to technical leaders, I would say leaders in general, especially in today's environment where so much of our interactions are like this, through a virtual platform like Zoom, is it's not just when you're speaking that you need to be conscious of the message and behavior that you're projecting, especially if you're on camera. Just when you're listening, just your facial expression can unintentionally cause someone to be rattled or questioned exactly what's going through your mind. So really being conscious of the messages that you're sending verbally in every interaction, whether you're the listener or the speaker. So let's talk about executive presence. I know this is something that comes up very often for you. It comes up from a lot of the technical people that we coach. How do you describe it? What is it? Because it can often seem so elusive. And what's your best advice for helping technical leaders to exhibit executive presence?
Yeah, and executive presence, it just generally speaking, is are you being perceived as an executive? Are you being perceived as a leader? And it, I would say that this is a very common question. And I've had this question at all levels of the organization. In fact, often more times from the more senior levels of the organization. I have VPs. How do I communicate more at the C level? I've had CEOs ask me, how do I communicate with my boards more effectively? So this is something, and communication and how you come across is extremely important. Some suggestions are to speak more slowly. If we're like really rushing, talking really quickly, we are not seen as being as confident or having as much authority. Being brief and emphasizing key points. And that goes back to what we talked about before, not getting lost in just the details, but making sure we talk about the context of those details. Why are we sharing those details? That becomes much more important in leadership positions than if we are just purely doing the technical work on our own. And I would also add add to that preparing, and that may seem like, well, duh, but I have seen so often that just as we would prepare for doing, our technical work, just as we would prepare and look things up and study things, sometimes we just try and wing it as leaders. And that leads to us not coming across as clearly. There are other small things like instead of saying, I think this is the reason, saying this is the reason, because the I think is implied, and if we say I think, I believe, sometimes that can de make it seem like we are less sure than we actually are. Those are the or types of verbal things that we can change. The other is body language. Small things like sitting at the head of the table, not cowering in the back, sitting upright, showing having some presence in the room in terms of sitting upright, not like trying to disappear, right? Um, Making eye contact, not averting people, and and something that I have to admit I did earlier in my career, which was scowling, or when we disagree. And again, as technical experts, we have definite opinions about things like it's right or it's wrong, right? And so if somebody says something we disagree with, it's very easy for us to go, or, roll our eyes or whatever. And the problem is, again, that's seen one way when it's a peer. If we want that executive presence, we need to be careful about having to checking how we are showing up and what emotions. I remember I was a member of a board and one of the other board members came to me after a meeting and said, "Wow, you looked really upset." And I had no idea that that is how I was showing up, right? I just thought I was internally going like, "Oh, that's a really not a good idea." But apparently it was really showing up on my face. And so I had to learn like, oh, to modulate how I was appearing so that I didn't look in that case, I don't want to look judgmental before I have fully understood, that's why it's not considered executive presence because we want our leaders to really understand the situation before they jump in with an opinion. And so that was something. And like little things like fidgeting, things like that to watch out for.
Yeah, there's a whole host of variables there that you have the opportunity to pinpoint and refine. And thank you so much for sharing something that you had to work on personally. The bottom line is we're infallible. There are lots of imperfections, and this isn't, of course, I always say about perfection. This is about connection. And if you misstep, own up to it. Just a few just tangible tips that I'll add to your point about, and it's not surprising, and we experience the same thing. Often, the higher up in leadership, the more coaching you are requesting to enhance your executive presence because the stakes are higher, the expectations are higher. So it's essential that you overcome any challenges you have to doing that more effectively. And some really tangible tools that can help with that are we subscribe heavily to frameworks, which can help you structure your thoughts and your message in a way that's really going to resonate with any particular audience, such as senior leadership, and help you to avoid getting into the weeds and focusing more on the so what, the business impact, than just the data dump, as you described. Another thing that I would strongly recommend, and again, in this type of environment that so many of us are working, it's so easy to do these days. Take the time to watch a recording of you participating in a meeting. It might not just be you presenting the whole time. It's even more helpful to see how you're showing up, both when you're presenting more in a formal way, as well as when you're the recipient or you're interacting. Because we all have blind spots, like you just acknowledged, Gwen. You had no idea you were coming across that way. And seeing those things firsthand, although somewhat painful, can be absolutely invaluable. Okay, so one of the things we talked about at the outset is this tendency to micromanage. What's your best advice for technical leaders to avoid that instinct?
Yeah, and micromanagement is partly about communication. And also, I loved that you brought up the concept of frameworks because absolutely, I think this is something that that technical experts really appreciate because again, our technical minds really appreciate frameworks rather than like, oh, just do this. Like one of the things that drives me nuts is like build trust. I'm like, okay. I mean, what does that mean? How do you do like, I want directions. I want specifics. Like, what are things I specifically can do something like build trust or not to micromanage? And micromanagement is one of the most frequent complaints that technical experts have about their leaders. So it's a very and it comes from our desire, it comes from the best of intentions, and that we want things done well. We want them done well, and it takes a lot of, we're working with people who can't do it as well as us, and we know how it should be done. So we're just going to tell them exactly how it should be done, right? But unfortunately, the people who are told exactly what to do, if they are highly capable, smart folks, which many of us, that's who our team members are. That's not how they want to work, and that's not how we want to work. We don't like being told, like, do it exactly this way. That's not why we became. That's that we pursued the technical aspects because we like answering questions. We want to understand why, etc. So I would say, so just from a communication standpoint, and I have in my book, Leadership for Scientists and Engineers, I do have a chapter on delegation with some additional tips in there, as well as lots of tips on communication in general. But I would say that one tool that I think is under that we don't use enough. And this is in general, and I'll probably say this a couple times today, but it comes out in delegation and when we try to micromanage, which is we are not actually asking enough questions. We are telling people things. And again, it always sort of surprises me because we ask questions about the technical aspects. We're very curious about that. But sometimes we forget to use that very good skill we have in asking other people. And sometimes it's because we think we know, and when we actually don't. And so one really quick thing that we can do to micromanage, because typically an untrained, and you've mentioned frameworks, and I do think that frameworks and tools and so much of what we're talking about, yes, maybe we will learn these things on our own, but so much of these things we can learn so much more quickly and so much
Faster.
better by getting some tips. Yeah. So one of the things that typically somebody who's never been trained and how to delegate without micromanaging, they have two styles that they go into, either full delegation, like, get this project done, go do it, or like, and they do that, the person goes off, they make some mistakes, and then they didn't do it right, I have to fix it, or I've got to tell them next time exactly how to do it. And that's where micromanagement, again, the best of intentions, I want it done well. But from a communication standpoint, if I instead invest the time to explain to them why I want things done a certain way, like the reason it has to be, we have to have a margin of 1 inch is because that funding agency will only accept this application if it's 1 inch, right? And that actually takes work. You might think, oh, that's obvious to explain why. But the issue is, going back to those blind spots you mentioned, that we often think that they know the reason why because we know the reason why. And that is a huge issue in communication, is I know the reason why. And it happens more when you are a leader because you have information that they don't oftentimes, or you've been doing it longer, or you have more context. So one is taking the time to explain to them why it should be done a certain way. The second is to ask them. This sounds so basic and easy, but we unless we have been encouraged to do it, most of us don't do that. It's very simple. When you ask them to do something, start asking them questions about how they plan to do it. How are you planning to do this project? What are you going to do first? What do you see as issues that might arise? When are you going to check in with me? How often do we need to check in and talk about this? And I would say that would be another communication thing to avoid micromanaging. Oh, this is great. So one of the big micromanaging things is to have people send you every email and check in every day and have all these things. Like that that's a huge complaint I hear all the time. And again, good intentions. The leader wants to know what's going on and make sure they catch things. What you want to do as a leader is be a little bit more careful and intentional, not just trying to check everything, but check like how much do I ask yourself? How much do I really need that information that day? Can I wait a week? What is there really any risk here? It's a lot about risk evaluation if there is a mistake, right? But also continuing to ask those questions, especially at the outset. And then you have a much better, clearer roadmap as to how often you should check in or what some of the issues might be. And again, it sounds so simple. It is simple, but we just forget. We just forget. Like if I let them do it, we forget to say how.
Yeah. Oh gosh, two very, very tangible pieces of advice. One is provide that context, provide the why. It's so obvious to us, which is why we often overlook it and don't take the time to explain it. And then the other is asking. So, walk me through how you intend to accomplish this because, as you pointed out, Gwen, it gives you insight on where to check in to avoid hovering and micromanaging, as well as insight into where they're going to need some coaching and direction. Yeah, excellent point. I want to pause for a minute and acknowledge something that came up in chat. Rick Gilbert says, when I was at HP in the 80s, a big deal was the career dual ladder. This allowed engineering talent to move up the income scale without needing to go into management, which they didn't want to do and were not good at. Yes, absolutely. So we are definitely not advocating that if you are a technical expert, the only way to advance and have even greater impact is to move into leadership. Not at all.
But
There are.
But can I add something that my theory is that there's often this thought that I can't be a leader, or one of the reasons technical experts often dislike, some of it's inherent, right? We got into it to solve the technical issues, but not the people issues. But I would also say that some of it is also because we have never learned how to do it, the tools and techniques for how to do it effectively. So, for example, if you don't know how to delegate in a way that you're not micromanaging, it's not fun, right? You're either like things aren't working or you're having to tell them all the specific. That's not fun, right? But if you learn some of these tools, so I agree on those separate tracks. But I am a really firm believer that anybody can become a decent leader if they are willing to be honest and they want to and are willing to ask questions and willing to learn. I think the evidence, that I've seen is not that somebody inherently can't be a leader. So, yes, they might not want to, and those separate tracks are great when the company can accommodate it. I work with many companies where that I was just literally talking to a CEO yesterday who wanted that separate track, but it was not a big enough company where that was going to be a possibility given the resources. So,
Yeah.
point well taken is that many technical experts are reluctant leaders and don't necessarily want to be doing it. But I'm a firm believer they can do it better and actually well with a few basic tools and some understanding if they want to, if they're willing.
Yeah. Thank you so much for saying that, Gwen. And I think the two nuggets there are if you want it, but are avoiding it because you don't feel like it's in your reach, it is. There are ways in which you can acquire tools, you can acquire coaching and knowledge to achieve that and be very successful at it. If you don't want it, though, don't pursue it. Good.
Yeah, and I
Good.
start my book out. My book starts out with like all of a sudden you were just happily doing your technical work, and all of a sudden they thrust this leadership on you. Now what do you do, right?
Yeah.
That's the common thing. It's like you weren't asking for it. They were just like, we need you to do it, and you're like, oh. Yeah.
Exactly. No, exactly. Um, so I'd love to hear a story. Can you share a story of a technically brilliant leader who transformed their impact simply by changing how they communicated?
Yeah, and I mean, there's I would say communication is one of the most frequent issues that leaders have, and one of the most easily fixable, actually, because with some of this insight. I'll give you two examples. One was a CEO who was having, the morale was really low in his company, and he wasn't sure why. And in working with him, what it became clear was he was overly critical and negative, and it was shutting down conversations. People weren't bringing information, and so he learned, because you can learn this, to focus not only on what wasn't working, but also to focus on what was working, what he was happy with, because you can reward things that are going well, and and people will do more of them. So when he started doing that, morale and motivation and excitement started to rise, because people could see that. And again, we're not computers. Like a chat gpt, I can tell it negative things from here till tomorrow, and it's not going to be upset. But people are not. We're just not hardwired like that. Our brains were wired by evolution, and so we hear negativity more loudly than positive. And then the second example where someone changed, this is for the folks who were asking about managing up, which is extremely important. I mean, all of this is important, but it's extremely common thing that people are wondering about, is that there was a technical expert who was having a lot of trouble. He was communicating with the CEO and having a lot of trouble getting, just it was just weird interactions, wasn't feeling appreciated, it was not working well. And so what he realized, we analyzed what was going on, and what he realized was that he was sending these really long emails to the CEO. And the CEO is like reading them on his phone, and like he'd read like the first sentence or maybe the first two sentences and then just sort of ignore the rest. And this technical expert thought he was communicating all this information, when realizing he was communicating that. So he switched how he presented the information. He sent much shorter emails, which saved him time, by the way. He started with the big picture, the reason, and this is a really good way in terms of managing up, is make sure you're talking about the impact, not just the details, the context. He started with the big picture, why, or the big question or whatever, and then backed it up. And he did that both in his emails and in his one-on-one conversations. And all of a sudden things really shifted. The CEO all of a sudden started to pay a lot of attention. He started to get, a lot more opportunities. Just that one shift from too many details, starting with the details and too many, to focusing on what do I really need here? What's the big picture? And how do I communicate that?
Yeah, we call that leading with the bottom line. That's such a wonderful example. And again, that's where structure, that's where framework can help. It's not just to enhance your ability to verbally communicate your message, but also in written form. Great. Thank you so much. Great example. So, how should leaders communicate bad news?
So um, I'll tell you one thing that I think is really important, and then I'm going to add one tip that actually is more general. So the one thing that I think is very helpful is to focus the energy on the future. To Because oftentimes when you are focusing on bad news, it's happened. But the fact that it's bad news, it's happened, right? And so there's not a whole lot that can be done. It is what it is. And so, generally not beating around the bush, just being very straightforward. This thing happened, or this is the situation. But then I think one thing that leaders can be especially powerful in doing is focusing on given that this is the situation, we didn't choose it, we don't love it, but given that situation, how can we move forward? What can we do? Right? We can't change the past. We can't change, you mentioned, we can't change what already happened, but what can, if it's projects get canceled all the time, right? They lose funding, they fail, whatever. And so that's bad news. Focusing instead on, okay, given that, where do we now want to put our energy? What would be the best use of our resources? And that is, especially when leaders do that, it can be especially helpful for teams to help guide that energy into something that they can do. Focusing on what they can't do, that tends to be very demotivating and very frustrating. But hey, given that this is a situation, yeah, it's not ideal, but let's move on. I also want to inject. Go ahead, Carrie.
Sorry, just a quick insert here, and such great advice. And this also ties to executive presence. One of the keys to exhibiting executive presence is remaining calm and composed under pressure. This happened. I love that you talked about being straightforward and transparent, not sugarcoating it. So let's talk about our options. What's the best way to move forward? Great.
Yeah, perfect. And I'll just add one other practical tip, which I think is you can start using today, which is to be getting some guidance from AI on how to frame things. And so I looked up, I put in into ChatGPT, which you can get for free. How do I tell someone their project has been canceled? Script it out. And it came up with, and it'll give you, AI, you have to be careful what it produces. You need to always review it and think about it. But for communication, I mean, it's as a, LLM, it is a language model. It often has very helpful suggestions. Again, use it you have to screen it out, and oftentimes you have to send different prompts to get it. But I put that simple prompt in. And what popped out is just an example. It will script it out for you. I wanted to update you on the status of the project. After reviewing priorities and resource allocation, leadership has decided to cancel the project effective immediately. I know you put significant work into this, and I want to acknowledge that effort. This decision isn't a reflection of your performance. It's a shift in strategic priorities. I'm happy to talk through what this means for next steps. And again, you probably wouldn't say that per se, but just the fact that we can use it as this private resource that's there that can give us suggestions. And I have very often, for managing up, for saying no, for all of those things, I will sometimes type in my draft. I'd love to hear in the chat who else has been doing this, because I do think it can be extraordinarily helpful and powerful to do that. So I'd love to see if anybody else is using AI to help with their communications. That would be helpful, I think, for us to know. I will often run emails through it and say, hey, how is the other person likely to respond? And sometimes it's like, not well, let's try and tone it down a little, or let's try and say this more diplomatically, right? So it can save us from really, having reactions that we don't necessarily want. So would love to see, again, if anybody's been using it. And if you haven't been using it, if that is like one thing you get out of this today, is I would say experiment with it, see what you get. I think it's a language tool. I think it can be very helpful around communication.
Absolutely. Lisa's sharing that I have a meeting summarizer I use to help ensure I'm not as long-winded. Very good point, Lisa. Very good point. Because you can also, I like to think of AI as a complementary partner. And I'm also a firm believer in playing to your strengths. So if you naturally are a very articulate communicator, you might not need to use it a lot for that. But if you have the challenge in analyzing dense detail, that might be when you use it. But yes, specific to communication, I think it's an invaluable tool. It also can be so useful because we were talking about the importance of making sure you're always audience centric in how you communicate, the word choices you use, etc. In your prompt, you can talk about, here's the characteristics of my target audience. Help me tailor the message in a way that's really going to resonate and land with them. The one final thing I'd say, especially if you're using it to help come up with a script that you are going to be communicating verbally, refine it to make it your own. Because if the message doesn't come off as truly authentic, it's going to fall flat. So all those variables are important to take into account. I want to talk about we've been talking about various types of communication in leadership roles. Let's talk about more communication with your team members, and specifically about how to effectively use one-on-ones. We often get feedback that they just feel like status updates, too transactional. How can you structure a one-on-one with individuals on your team so that they're a more productive, valuable use of time?
Yeah, that is one of the, I would say, to me, that's one of the great examples of how we often promote people, technical experts, into leadership positions and expect them to magically know how to do a one on one, right? And I have a whole chapter in my book on one on ones because they are the bread and butter across all industries, what we expect leaders to do with their direct reports. And yes, if nobody's ever like, you think, "Oh, it's just status updates. Why do I even need to have them?" Right? Well, a one-on-one ideally, and one of the things I think we talked about templates, so I even have an agenda. I've suggested topics and an agenda in the book because it's like, yeah, how are you supposed to know what to do unless somebody gives you a framework? So some of the other very specific things you can do in one-on-ones is to give feedback. It's a great time for that. Ask for feedback and then support their careers. And then I would also say, because it's a one-on-one time, it just allows them to speak to you in ways that they might not in other situations because it's scheduled. So they often appreciate it more than maybe you need it. Like sometimes people, the leader thinks it's just for them. No, no, it's also for your report. So they have an opportunity. I would also say that an underutilized tool I see is to make sure your priorities are aligned. If you're in it all in an innovative environment, then things can be moving very quickly. And so, and a simple way to do that is have your reports come in and say, what are your current priorities? And it's helpful to your direct reports because they get to see and prioritize. It's helpful for you to make sure they're working on what you think is most important. So I would say all of those things that a one-on-one, and one of the exercises I do, and we do a leadership boot camp, and one of the really one of the exercises that we do, which people are really enthusiastic about, is they just share their own best practices, either what they've experienced or what they're doing that work. And so I would say, ask ask your peers, like, what are they doing in their one-on-ones? What has worked well? Think back to yourself, like when you've had great one-on-ones, what did they look like? It's also, you mentioned if you are leading people virtually, it's even more important. And you can use it as a time to ask them, hey, how was your weekend? What's going on? Like, you don't want to it's not about getting too personal, but it's about knowing enough about them that you have a real relationship with them. So, know what their pets' names are, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah, good. Lots of excellent advice in there. One of the things I really appreciated you bringing up is, and it's why I personally feel weekly cadence is essential. And it doesn't have to be long. They can be, just 30 minutes if needed or longer, depending on what's going on. But given how rapidly things are changing, and especially how complex things can be in very large organizations, misalignment can happen so quickly and result in such wasted time and productivity. So I love that. And we have that practice at Power Speaking. Just what are your top, if you get nothing else done this week, what are your top priorities? And it's a wonderful time to talk about, what, things have shifted. So yes, thank you, Gwen. So I'd love to touch on something that some of you in our audience acknowledged is one of your greatest challenges, going back to the poll that I shared at the very beginning, and that is delivering difficult feedback without eroding trust, without causing someone to get on the defense and shut down versus truly being open and serving as a great growth opportunity.
Yeah, so I have great news is that feedback conversations, even tough ones, do not need actually most of the time to be nearly as hard. There are two things that happen like that cause them to be much harder than they need to be. One is something, again, completely unintentional that we do, which is we draw conclusions. Our brains are designed to incorporate information and come to conclusions. Sometimes people call it the ladder of inference. I see something happen and I decide this is what is true about it. Or you can think of it as mind reading, right? And we do this without realizing, even those of us who are technically trained to just look at the data, it turns out that one of the reasons we have to be technically trained to just look at the data is because that's what our default brain does, is comes to conclusions, right? So hardwired to do that. So if we do that, so for example, if we say that was rude or you were being rude, right? That's going to be a terrible, awful, unpleasant conversation, right? So I do have a framework in the book and I like it because it's very short. It's called the AID framework, and A stands for action. The I is impact. The D is do. So the action is, what did I observe? What did I actually observe? So I can't observe someone being rude because that has a mental component to it. I might really think they were rude, but I actually don't know what they were thinking. That's mind reading. What I did see is that they started talking while somebody else was mid sentence. That is a much cleaner conversation than saying, "You were rude. Stop being so rude," right? So, or sloppy. Like, that was really sloppy, right? Again, that's not a complimentary word. And it's, who knows? Like, sloppy can mean a whole lot of things. If I instead say something like that calculation was wrong, that calculation was not correct, that's a much cleaner conversation. And then second, the impact. And there's a lot of advice out there that says if I just put the word I on, it's okay to say I'm upset, I'm frustrated. And I in my experience, I don't see how that helps you. If you're saying I'm frustrated, I'm upset, like all of a sudden, because of that power imbalance, all of their attention's like, oh, my boss is upset, my boss is frustrated. Instead of, no, the reason we're having this conversation about the data or the calculations being wrong is because it meant we missed our deadline, or it meant the other subsequent work had to be redone because of the calculations are repeated. And so if we again keep that pretty clean, then the conversation is just so much less loaded. We're all here to make sure, like, one of the great things is that if you're a leader, one of the great things is that your team, your employees want to do a good job. They are highly motivated to do a good job. They lose motivation when they can't do a good job. And that's true for us too, right? So so we're all aligned around that. So if we think about those conversations, if they want to be doing a good job, I want them to be doing a good job, then they become a lot easier. And then the do part, we need to make sure we're clear about it. Again, it's sometimes if we just say, do it more carefully next time. I say, I don't know. What does that mean? Does that mean you want them to repeat it? Does that mean you want them to ask somebody else? I'm not sure you have to be a little bit, and there's the SMART goals framework, specific, measurable, attainable, relevant, time bound, that can be helpful in those situations. So I would say yes that those conversations are way harder when you don't have those tools, because you're all of a sudden spinning out and they're like, but if you just focus on what are the facts here, why does it impact the work, and what specifically needs to be done differently to correct this situation, all of a sudden it becomes a factual conversation and not a judgment. It's just like, no, this is what the work requires. And so it doesn't solve all problems, but it can really be helpful, not to, in terms of reducing a lot of all of the edge to things.
Yeah.
That's my philosophy.
I love that. And I love that you started out by saying, I have great news. It doesn't have to be that hard. That's excellent. We have a question from Diana. What is your advice for managing up? For example, oh, great point, Diana. Because talk about the power dynamic there. For example, when giving constructive feedback to your manager.
So you do have to be more careful when you're because of that power imbalance. It is harder to give feedback up than down. But and you have to be careful. I would say never confront your somebody above you in front of other people. That tends to not go well. Just whether it should or shouldn't can't not speaking to that, but just what are the consequences of that? And there's some leaders where it goes okay, but be careful about that. Generally, not the best. So do it in a one-on-one. And I would say again, focusing the aid that formula can use here. If you're, I always say you're on firm ground if you are just talking about how it impacts the work. And so, when you ask me to send you, you have been asking me to send you an email every day outlining where I am in the project. That's the action, right? Instead of saying you're micromanaging me, just this is the action that I'm experiencing. The impact is I'm spending a half hour to an hour writing that email to you rather than getting more work done. And then what would you like to be different, which is in the future, do you think we could make this so that, we're checking in once a week, given our schedule on things, I think that probably would satisfy what you need, et cetera, et cetera. You might go through it. Notice that one thing that's different when you are managing up, when you get to that due, and in general, when you're managing up, is ask questions rather than state things, right? Because when you are the manager or leader, you can state things because that's your role, right? When you are trying to manage up, then you need to often couch things with, have you considered that, have you thought about, could we? And that softens it a little bit if to when you're managing up. So yeah.
Yeah,
I
I
had a whole
love that.
chapter on managing up in my book. No, it's a really important thing. It's hard, right? And it's a
Yeah.
question I get a lot because it's not easy. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Really, really great advice and specific example. I would say um, timing is also very critical when providing that feedback. So that's again, if it's not time sensitive, that's a great opportunity in your one-on-one because that's a time when your leader is carved out time focused specifically on you and what it is you need to accomplish. So perfect avenue to provide that feedback as opposed to potentially catching the leader off guard when their head is on some totally different plane. Okay, let's close with some closing advice. For leaders listening today, change just one communication behavior this month, what would have the biggest ripple effect on their teams?
So I thought, yeah, so that's always hard to say, but I would say one really quick thing that very few of us do well enough is to actively listen, to make sure we're giving them our full attention, to make sure we are asking questions, to make sure we are letting them finish, to make sure we are not, before we get into judge. And by the way, because we've been mentioning AI, we'll put a link into the chat if you want to practice and see how good you are at active listening. We have at Vivo Group, we have a AI tool that allows you to practice conversations, and the one we have as a demo is active listening. And you can see, and you will get feedback. You will see the whole conversation. You'll get feedback at the end. And we'll put the link into the chat, but you're welcome to try it out and see how it goes. And you'll get to see, I think, another way AI is going to improve human conversation, of human communication, by allowing us to actually practice conversations and receive feedback. So you do have to put your email in. It just comes to me. So.
Absolutely. And Gwen, it's already in chat. Our producer is right on it. And I can say, audience, Gwen kindly demoed that for me, and I can share firsthand that it's very, very powerful. So I encourage you to take advantage of it. Okay, so you touched on AI. Looking ahead, how do you think the expectations for technical leaders' communication skills are evolving, especially in more complex AI-driven environments?
Yeah, that's the big question, right? So I think that two things I think are pretty clear. One is that we're going to need to know, leaders are going to be expected to communicate during times of change and uncertainty. There's a lot of change and uncertainty right now for many different factors, AI being one of them, how our roles are changing. Two, I would say I think it's going to be essential for AI, for leaders to have AI literacy, to have a working knowledge. I read you the example of like how it can help you in conversations. For those of you who try the conversation tools, if you ever want to run an email through it and get some feedback, I do think the level of communication is going to be expected is going to be raised, and also that not AI is not going to not going to replace it, because it doesn't do it 100%. We still need people to review it and edit it. So I think those two things is knowing how to communicate during change, and to making sure to take full advantage of what AI can offer, with recognizing that it can't function on its own. I was just reading the article today about there's a place where the AI can talk to itself, and it just got us all nutty, right? So we still need humans here for now, but I do think, the leaders that know how to use the AI are going to be at a huge advantage over those who don't. So I would say,
For
those are
sure.
built on that.
For sure. I would just add one more. I would say the fact that AI is just increasing the rate of information and content that's being disseminated is making it even harder to punch through the noise. And therefore, it underscores the importance, if you don't currently do this effectively, spend time learning how to deliver your message in a very concise, compelling way. That skill is going to become more and more and more important, given just all of the noise that's out there. So, Gwen, I can't thank you enough. We
Thank
could
you.
have this conversation for a whole nother hour. And audience, you've been absolutely terrific. And I encourage you to check out all of the rich resources that have been put into chat for you. And thank you, Gwen, for offering those invaluable tools. And in closing, I am going to give you a preview of what we will be discussing next week: the neuroscience of communication and connection. I encourage you to join in. And if there are topics that you would like us to cover this year, please share your feedback. We welcome it. Thank you again.
Thank you. Thank you, Carrie. Great to be here.
Thank you, Gwen.